Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 362. In this episode, we're approaching the end of our journey through the fall of Númenor as we explore the founding of Arnor and Gondor after the downfall of Númenor. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, and KG. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in February of 2024. We've got a little bit of a long list here, and I've organized this into, organize this into how many years. So, for the 2-year club for February, we've got Shane Wise, Sean S, Doc G, and Andrew M. For the 3-year club, we've got Robert H., Sarah W. For the 4-year club, John R. For the 5-year club, Sarah M., John Rice, Ish of the Hammer, David Bigwood, Kat L., and Asya V. And for the 6-year club, we have Eric B. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. It's amazing to hear about people 3, 4, 5, 6 years in. Just very honored by that, and thank you all so much. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lands you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. If you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right. With Númenor having come to its bitter and tragic end, we discover that a small remnant has survived to carry on the best of its legacy in Middle-earth. Elendil and his 2 sons, Isildur and Anárion. And their survival is crucial, for even though Sauron himself fell into the abyss that destroyed Númenor, it's hard to keep the Dark Lord down. The original sources for this portion are primarily Unfinished Tales, Lord of the Rings appendices, Akalabaith, The People of Middle-earth, History of Middle-earth, Volume 12, and Letters. All right, so we pick up in the year 3320. The downfall of Númenor was in 3319. And we have this brief message in the text. So the end of the Second Age draws on in a major catastrophe, but it is not yet quite concluded. From the cataclysm, there are survivors. So this story, even though Númenor, sometimes I think especially early on when I was studying, when I was kind of getting familiar with the whole legendarium, I may have even had in my mind that the Second Age actually ended with the fall of Númenor, with the downfall of Númenor. But it doesn't, actually. There is about 100 years more of the Second Age to go, even after the fall of Númenor. So even though the Second Age began with the founding of Númenor, and actually even there, it doesn't actually begin in year 1 with the founding of Númenor. Númenor is actually not founded until a few years into that first century of the Second Age. So really, you can kind of think of the First Age as being the fall of Morgoth, which ends the First Age, and then the Second Age is going to have to do with what becomes of Sauron. But Sauron is still alive and kicking because, unfortunately, he is immortal. Right? He is immortal. He is a god. So he is able to survive even what kills the physical body. We'll get more into that whole issue in just a minute. But I wanted to touch on this footnote that is referenced here, footnote 1 in this chapter, where Tolkien writes, Elendil, a Noachian figure who has held off from the rebellion and kept ships manned and furnished off the east coast of Númenor, flees before the overwhelming storm of the Wrath of the West, and is borne high upon the towering waves that brings ruin to the west of the Middle-earth. He and his folk are cast away as exiles upon the shores. Noachian references the patriarch Noah, who appears in the biblical story of the deluge, both being faithful to their beliefs and prepared for what might befall. So the reference here to a Noachian figure, Elendil being a Noachian figure, is really interesting to me because we've a couple of times in this podcast over the course of the years we've actually devoted whole episodes to Mythopoeia from Tree and Leaf, which is just one of my favorite non-Middle Earth works of Tolkien. It's a poem he actually wrote to C.S. Lewis, and during their friendship, and it kind of describes how Tolkien made the case to Lewis for belief in God, and how that eventually led Lewis, who was an atheist when they first met, to embrace a belief in God, and then eventually become fully Christian. So I wanted to read this little passage from Mythopoeia because I think this is appropriate. Blessed are the men of Noah's race that build their little arks, though frail and poorly filled, and steer through winds contrary towards a wraith, a rumor of a harbor guessed by faith. So I've always loved that little bit. There's this part of the poem where Tolkien has these kind of little his own like kind of spin on the Beatitudes, I guess. And he of course references the men of Noah's race that build their little arks, though frail and poorly filled, and steer through winds contrary towards a wraith, a rumor of a harbor guessed by faith. I mean, that to me describes Elendil to a T right there. So when he wrote that particular verse in Mythopoeia, I wonder if he had this figure in mind. I'm not sure if the timing would quite work out if he would have thought of him as Elendil at that time. Nevertheless, I think this figure in his mind maybe goes back to roughly around the time when Mythopoeia was written, or maybe just before it was published. And so it's possible, maybe it's possible, I'm not sure. But anyway, this whole kind of the archetype, I think, of a kind of this figure who's fleeing over the seas, and this kind of like small ship, of course, is very much an Elendil thing, right? At the end of the first age, Elendil undertakes that big voyage to the Blessed Realm in his small ship, though it's not quite, maybe not necessarily as cataclysmic on that initial voyage for him. I'd have to check that, but obviously there's no like breaking of the world, like this like kind of cataclysmic downfall that causes whole lands to fall into the abyss. That is here at the downfall of Númenor, and so Elendil is that figure. So anytime I get a chance to reference something like Mythopoeia, I like to, and I think referencing that here is quite appropriate to say that this sort of figure, the Elendil figure, is a very important one, I think, in Tolkien's mind. All right. So the next section gives the basic outline of this chapter, which is Elendil and his 2 sons escape with 9 ships, a seedling of Nimloth, and the 7 Palantiri. They come to Middle-earth in a pretty catastrophic way, which we will discuss in a moment. Elendil's first words when he sets, I'm actually not gonna try, because I tried a couple of times today to prep myself for saying Elendil's first words when he sets foot on Middle-earth. I would butcher them, and I don't want to do that. So I'll just read the translation. Out of the great sea to Middle-earth I am come. In this place will I abide, and my heirs unto the ending of the world. Great line. And I was thinking to myself, next time Greta and I move into a new home, I think I'm going to say some variation of these words when when it's kind of official and we actually step foot into our new home. So I'll have to remember that for future reference. All right. Notably, as a Númenorian ruler, okay, Elendil lives far longer than the last several rulers, 322 years, the most since Tar al-Karin, 9 rulers before. I found this really interesting. What does this signify? Okay, because if you think about it, like I've actually created for myself this little handy dandy table of the different lifespans, like different kind of factors of the different rulers of Númenor. I'll try to make it a little bigger there so you can see it. But our father Zone only lived to 201 years old. Tar Palantir, who was actually, tried to return Númenor to kind of its faithful roots, right? only lived 220 years. But if you go back into the early history of Númenor, they were living upwards of like 400 years, right, and longer. So I think this signifies, that Elendil is on the right track, right? That he's truly striven to live in a way that reflects the best of what Númenor has to offer. And who knows? He might have ended up as we'll find out in the next episode when we discuss the final chapter and all of this, the final great events of the Second Age. It's possible that had Elendil not died in combat, he would have lived even longer, right? So who knows? Maybe he could have lived, all the way to 500 years as Elros had when he first founded Númenor. All right, and we also learn that that the Elendil and his sons were kinsmen of the king, true descendants of Elros, but the split from the ruling line goes back a long way. So I think this portion is included in the description of Elendil is the king, the first king in exile. I mean, he's called let's see here. So he's called a king of Númenor, Elendil of Númenor, High King of Gondor and Arnor, right? The Númenorian kings in exile. He is the first of this group. You might say, so was this contentious at all? Like, how did he become the king? And because couldn't there have been like other survivors that should have been? And the reason is because it goes like this split in the House of Elros goes way back, right? So if I'll bring up my my spreadsheet there with the different kings again here soon. But the point is that yes, Elendil and his sons were true descendants of Elros, but the split from the main line of the ruling part of the House of Elros had occurred many centuries before. Really a couple of millennia before, maybe even like close to 3 millennia before. So this had gone back a long way. All the way to Tar Elendil, ironically, right? Tar Elendil was Númenor's fourth ruler, whose father was also Amandil, right? So we have this interesting sort of, parallelism that I'm sure Tolkien intended. You have Amandil, Elendil, and then after Elendil, the line splits. Okay, the line splits, and then we get the Lords of Andunier as a separate line, and the ruling house, really the line of Tar Maneldur, who takes over after Tar Elendil. And so what happened there, if you'll recall from many episodes back, and let me go here to my spreadsheet. Tar Elendil's oldest child was a daughter, Silmarion, but at that time ruling queens were not a thing. So her line became the Lords of Andunier. So it would seem that the line of descendants of Tar Elendil's only son, Tar Maneldur, had in fact died out with the deaths of Pharazôn and Miriel. Now, this might seem a little bit surprising because you have that much history, that many generations. You're going to have like so many different like kind of offshoots of that line of Tar Maneldur, that it almost seems like there should be others that maybe have more of a right, okay, to the throne. But there doesn't seem to be any contention, at least none that Tolkien mentions. I suppose that could be kind of an interesting subplot for a show like The Rings of Power, maybe to explore later on down the line. But they haven't really done a good job of incorporating this whole notion of Elendil being like this kind of high figure in this family of lords, right? That he's like the next Lord of Andunier, right? They haven't really done much to say that or show that the Lords of Andunier are actually kind of a important family in Númenor. So yeah, apparently all of the House of Tar Maneldur died out with the end of the Númenor, with the downfall of Númenor. Now, I suppose it's possible that there was some, further down the line, there was some intermarriage between the houses of Tar Maneldur and Silmarion, and so maybe, in a way, like Elendil is descended on through a female side from the House of Tarman Eldor. I'm not like a guru on how such things work. I had a I think I've mentioned this story before. I have a friend from high school who was a funny guy, and he found out at one point that he was like the 42nd and the 42nd in line to be the Duke of some place or other in England. And so he made kind of a big deal about that. He would in some cases refer to himself as the 42nd Duke, of course in jest, just kind of the irony of like, well, if anything happens to the 41 before me, then I guess I'll be this elevated to this dukedom. So dukedom, is that a thing? But the reality of it is when you get that far down the line, that many centuries removed from great figures, if you're from a certain part of the world, then you probably have some blood relation to that figure. And I like to think of like people, like I think like most people of like with any European ancestry at this point probably have some direct blood relation to Charlemagne, right? Or if you're from the British Isles, you probably have some direct blood relation to like certain kings, or I think like figures like Braveheart, like William Wallace. Like there's a lot of cases of like that sort of descent, or like Robert the Bruce, and you'll be like, oh, cool, I'm descended from this person, and then you're like, oh, well, so is everybody else, who's from this part of the world. Anyway, I digress. Just kind of a funny little factoid there. But the important thing to take away here is that even though this goes back a long way, Elendil, there seems to be the consensus that he is the new ruler of Númenor. And so he is the king of Númenor, even as they are in exile and found these new realms of Arnor and Gondor. Okay. So, Elendil and his sons leave in these 9 ships, and they're kind of, it's not just that they sail away. It's like they're cast up upon these like crazy waves. I think in one place it even says they're like, it's almost like the waves reach to the skies, right? They're like mountains into the skies. These are serious waves. They do some damage, kind of push back, like change the shape of the coastline actually of Middle Earth some, in addition to destroying Númenor. But at some point they get separated, and Elendil and his ships wind up in the north, and Isildur and Anárion and their ships wind up in the south. So let's talk about the foundings of these two kingdoms, and how these 9 ships come to Middle Earth. So let's look at our map of Middle Earth right here. So as I said, we kind of bring this out to the full view. So we can think of it like this. So at some point, Númenor being was over here. So at some point, the ships of Elendil go up this way, right? E there. And at some point, and at a similar point, the ships of Isildur and Anárion wind up in the south. Elendil makes his way to the Gulf of Lune, and eventually sails up the River Lune. He meets with Gil-galad and sails up the River Lune. Isildur and Anárion, they make their way to the mouth of the Anduin and sail up to Osgiliath. And we'll get into a little more detail on each of these situations here in just a moment. So I believe, just because I mentioned this, I believe what happens to the coastline of Middle Earth is that this portion, the northern portion, the seas actually encroach some on it. So perhaps this jutted out a little further, because I think this is showing, this is showing the map of Middle Earth in like the late Third Age, but these coastlines may have extended out a little further before the Cataclysm, but they're pushed back, right? They're pushed back to what we see as the boundaries here in the Third Age. And then kind of a reverse effect here. So the coastlines in the south actually came out some. So the waters here receded some, maybe so the other waters could push up here. And so before, for example, Pelargir had been, which is right here on the map, Pelargir had actually been a coastal city, but now it's kind of further up the mouth of the, further up from the mouth of the Anduin. So just an interesting little side note there. All right. So we have Elendil, and he will journey further up the River Lune. Okay, and he will journey into kind of the heart of Eriador, and which is this whole region here. And he is going to, we see it here called the Lost Realm of Arnor, but he is going to found this kingdom of Arnor in the north, right? And really Arnor, you can kind of think of it as like it's going to really kind of create this kingdom over most of Eriador, especially the northern parts of Eriador that are not inhabited by elves. Okay, so really the elves, they kind of tend to stick to like smaller like cities and that kind of thing. Men seem to like their space. Probably there's probably more of them. It's probably because men have shorter lifespans, but they also produce more offspring, and so over the course of their lives, multiple generations can go by, and elves might have one or two children, but it'll be multiple generations of men and produce larger families, so they want more land. And so it's this region here that becomes Arnor, and then Gondor is founded to the south. We'll come back to Gondor in a moment. The first capital. Let's zoom in some on Arnor here. So, the first capital of Arnor is Anúmenas, right, which is founded here at Lake Evendim Nanuniel. All right. Later, there will be the capital city will be moved to Fornost. But some of the important regions that are mentioned here, we have. Let me get rid of these drawings. Here we go. So we have Weathertop, which is Amansul. All right, famous from, of course, Lord of the Rings, as the site that Frodo gets stabbed by one of the ring wraiths. And we have the Tower Hills over here, also known as Amen Baread. So it's interesting because you'll notice that on this map we have like Hobbiton and the Shire and Bree and all these places. But once upon a time, right, at the end of the Second Age and into the first centuries of the Third Age, Arnor is really the major kingdom of the Númenóreans in exile, right? It becomes a pretty powerful kingdom in its own right. But by the time the Lord of the Rings rolls around, it's a distant memory, right? It's ruins at that point. Okay. None of these places, it's inhabited by hobbits at that point, and or at least a good portion of it. But Arnor is but a distant memory at that point, right? And you think about like 3,000 years of history, because Lord of the Rings takes place 3,000 years into the Third Age. I mean, it's almost like thinking of like Rome or something like that, right? Going back way far into history, Rome in its glory was 2,000 years before our time right now. So it's even further back in a way, right? It's even now maybe we can make the case that like Arnor lasted until a certain time in the Third Age, so maybe 1,000 years or something like that into the Third Age, and then Rome was of course founded, maybe several hundred years before, before the time of Christ. So it's possible that it's a very similar sort of correlation in terms of the length of time between the Lord of the Rings and the founding of Arnor itself. But the important thing is that it's not often realized that Arnor became a very powerful and important kingdom in Middle Earth. It's gone and in ruins, and kind of a ghost land in a lot of areas in the time of in the time of the Lord of the Rings, which is part of what lends Lord of the Rings some of its amazing aura, right, and some of that verisimilitude, because we look at a lot of the things going on and it's like, oh, that was once a great like watchtower, and now it's just this like kind of barren place we know as Weathertop, right? Okay, so Isildur and Anárion, they go up the Anduin to Osgiliath, already somewhat populated by elf friends of Númenorian descent, and I want to read a little bit here before we come back to our map. All right, so the chief city of this southern realm was Osgiliath, through the midst of which the great river flowed. And the Númenorians built there a great bridge, upon which there were towers and houses of stone wonderful to behold, and tall ships came up out of the sea to the quays of the city. Other strong places they built also upon either hand. Minas Ithil, the tower of the rising moon, eastward upon a shoulder of the mountain of shadow as a threat to Mordor, and to the westward Minas Anor, the tower of the setting sun, at the feet of Mount Mindoluin, as a shield against the wild men of the dales. In Minas Ithil was the house of Isildur, and in Minas Anor the house of Anárion. But they shared the realm between them, and their thrones were set side by side in the great hall of Osgiliath. These were the chief dwellings of the Númenorians in Gondor, but other works marvelous and strong they built in the land in the days of their power, at the Argonath, and at Aglarond, and at Erech, and in the circle of Angranost, which men called Isengard. They made the pinnacle of Orthanc of unbreakable stone. So a lot of interesting stuff here. We get word about Osgiliath, and that it was really, already in existence at this point, founded by, people who were of Númenorian descent who had maybe, settled in this land at some time before, and they were actually friendly. They were of the faithful mindset. So that certainly worked out in the favor of these exiles who landed here. We also get word of, and Osgiliath sounds like a pretty amazing. This great bridge that's described with the towers and houses of stone sounds pretty amazing. I would love to see that, depicted on screen. I know it was somewhat depicted in the Lord of the Rings films, but it was kind of in ruins at that point. And after reading this description here, I'm not even sure those ruins really did it justice. But anyway. We have, and then word about these two towers, Minas Ithil and Minas Anor. Of course, in Lord of the Rings, they are known as Minas Morgul. Minas Ithil becomes Minas Morgul, and Minas Anor becomes Minas Tirith. Okay, we'll talk about that much more, and later on discuss that in previous episode, of course. But as we get into what comes next after our journey through the fall of Númenor, which is almost done. We will eventually get to talking about those towers a good bit. All right. And then, of course, we get the word about Isengard, Orthanc, and how Angranost, this great pinnacle, was created by the Númenorians as well. Okay, so we also have word of what was brought with them, the Palantiri, the white tree, which is planted in Minas Ithil initially, and then the scepter of the lords of Andunier. So we have these various artifacts that are brought to Middle-earth from Númenor by the faithful, the faithful remnant there. All right. The 7 stones, the 7 Palantiri, it says they were divided 3, 2, and 2. So Elendil had 3, and then Isildur and Anárion had 2 each. So 3 wound up in the north, and 4 wound up in the south. Elendil distributed his to the Tower Hills, Amansul, and Anúmenos. So if we go back to our map here, hit clear on this. So we have the Tower Hills, which are right here. And we have Anúmenos, which is right here. And we have Weathertop, which is right here. Looks like somebody erased over it just says Urtop. This says Weath, so I think that's Weathertop right there. So that's where the 3 were distributed in the north. And then if we go to the south, they were distributed at Osgiliath, Minas Ithil, and Minas Tirith, as well as where is it? Oh, here we go. It might not be marked. Oh, right there. There it is, Isengard. Okay. It's interesting, you can see that Gondor, at least kind of the centrality of its power, is a lot more concentrated. The Seeing Stones here, but you see the symmetry or the layout of the stones here, and of course it goes back to the wrong size. I'll just go back to my 175, and they'll be the right place. All right, so Orthanc is really becomes this like halfway post between Arnor and Gondor, right? There's vast distance between these two areas. Our key here is 250 miles. If I'm just looking at that, I mean, it's at least 500 miles from Osgiliath to Isengard, probably closer to 750, and then probably 1,000 miles from Isengard to Númenor, which on foot or horseback, that is a long, long way. That is no day trip in a car. So, well, it is a day trip in a car, but it's much longer when you're on horseback or especially on foot. So, it's a long haul in a car, though. I've done those kinds of drives a few times in one day, and it's a long day. Hopefully, you're driving through some pretty country. So Isengard there is in the middle, but these Palantiri allow for communication between Arnor and Gondor, and also they kind of give extra capability to these rulers of Númenor to use in anticipation of their enemies' movements. So that's helpful as well. All right. One other thing that's worth saying about the Palantiri, we've done a whole episode on the Palantiri before. One other thing that's interesting to say about them or read about them is their origin. So let's read about that real quick. Speaking of the Seeing Stones, Gandalf said, "The Palantiri came from beyond Westerness, from Aldamar. The Noldor made them. Feanor himself maybe wrought them in days so long ago that the time cannot be measured in years. But there is nothing that Sauron cannot turn to evil uses. Perilous to us all are the devices of an art deeper than we possess ourselves." So anyway, what I find interesting there is that the origin of them is from Eldamar, right? From beyond Westerness, Eldamar, in the regions of the elves in the Blessed Realm, and that the Noldor of the Blessed Realm did make them, and perhaps even Feanor himself, which is pretty amazing to think about. Okay. So Sauron returns to Mordor. We learn that Sauron returns to Mordor, though he was cast into the abyss with Númenor being a Maya, a spiritual and not corporeal being in essence, he survives. All right? Because really, his bodily form is almost just clothing that he puts on, right? It's just clothing that he puts on, or analogous to the clothing we put on our bodies, right? He does not need his body, as part of his essential essence. It's just something he puts on. He returns to Mordor on a dark wind, unable to resume a form that was fair to men. And so, after what I just said about it being like clothes he put on, it's like, why? Why can't he just put back on the same clothes, or like make a nice outfit for himself again and put that on for himself? It's a really interesting question, actually, and I don't have kind of an easy answer for you, but it reminded me of this passage from the end of Elendil, and I wanted to go ahead and read this. This is one I puzzle over all the time. I'm not exactly sure what Tolkien means here, but I think I have a good idea of it. Let me read this. "Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by love of the children of Ilúvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after that manner which they had beheld in the vision of Ilúvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world rather than of the world itself. And they need it not, save only as we use raiment, and yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female, for that difference of temper they had even from the beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us male and female may be shown by the raiment, but is not made thereby. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Ilúvatar. For at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought, made visible in forms of majesty and dread." So here's my takeaway. I think that Sauron, who was originally created a good, right? Even Melkor was originally created good, right? All of these figures are created good by Ilúvatar, but they fall at some point. So my thought here is that Sauron is not able to put back on a fair hue because he has given himself over so much to evil at this point, that he is incapable of having the mind that would allow him to be in a fair hue. He is so bent on darkness and evil doing, and he views the world through such a his mind views the world through such a dark lens that he is unable to fashion something that would be a fair hue to someone else, right? To a human, okay, to a mortal, or to a corporeal being like men or elves. So I think that's what's going on. Not a perfect reading. I'd love this. That's a question I would have loved Tolkien to expound upon a little more. But I think that's what's going on. I believe Sauron has just given himself over. Just think about it, right? He plotted and plotted. He's been given opportunities to repent. He plotted and plotted, not just to kill certain figures, but to just overthrow an entire civilization and destroy and bring it down to utter ruin, and inspired people to assail the Blessed Realm, right? So, that takes a really dark mind. If you ever think about, like, people who have just done really awful things, whether it be on a grand scale, the Stalins or the Hitlers, or the different sorts of megalomaniacal figures of historical note, or you just think about like mass murderers or serial killers or something like that. The people who conceive to do these dark things, you just wonder, like how could they have to, like, how could they actually do these things? They have to give themselves over to some dark mind, because no one like of a good mind would be able to continue doing those things to such a degree, right? No one of a good mind would be able to continue doing those things to such a degree. I don't know if that's the best explanation. That's just kind of how I read it. But I think it's a really interesting question, and one worth pondering. Nevertheless, from this point on, his power was through terror alone, it says. And also Sauron prepares for war. He is not going to rest. He's not going to give himself another, he knows that the remnant of Númenor is on its heels. And so he wants to strike again as soon as he's able to. And since they're close now, being in Gondor and he in Mordor, he will do so, and he plans to do so. All right. Let's take a quick look at the one illustration for this chapter, which would be this pencil sketch, and I believe this would be Elendil emerging from the sea. Nice image there. Very much looking like, we just survived something crazy, and I am just going to kiss the land as soon as I step foot upon it. Nice pencil sketch there. Okay. In studying history, we often hear of the fall of great civilizations, I think especially of Rome, though many others could be listed. In speaking of such finalities, it may be tempting to imagine that fall means complete and utter end. And while in some sense it does, there are always survivors who carry on, and with the end of such civilizations, as kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, it is small groups of survivors, Noachian bands, as Tolkien might call them, who take up the monumental task of building something new and strong out of what remains. So it is with the great Elendil and his sons, and all the more pressing is their task, for the threat of Sauron wastes little time in plotting what he hopes will be his final blow against what remains of Númenor. All right. Well, no correspondence for this week. Not that there hasn't been some in the backlog. Got plenty of that, but a little longer episode, and so didn't have a time to prepare response or thoughts on that. But please do keep the correspondence coming, and we will respond to you somehow and at some point. Don't forget to stop by TrueMythPress.com for great merch like super styling and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, Two Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMythPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And thank you to our amazing fellowship, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Richard K, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Matt R, John W, Eugene D, Alaskan Moose 31, Chris B, Daniel S, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Seb M, Brian O II, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O I, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. All right. Well, thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.